It's easy to cry out in frustration and worry when life feels overwhelming. We question why things aren't going the way we expect, and it's natural to feel a sense of loss. But here's a truth that will shift your perspective. God is already working on your behalf. You don't need to carry the weight of your burdens alone. When you place your trust in Him, He will work things out in ways you can't even imagine. Today, I want to remind you that no matter how heavy the situation may seem, God's hand is in motion, and He will make a way where there seems to be no way. Stop crying, because God is already working it out. I know the struggle is real. Life throws its challenges at us, and there are days when it feels like the darkness will never end. But listen to this: God will work it out. He is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. Your situation hasn't caught Him off guard. Sometimes we cry because we think God is late. But let me tell you, His timing is perfect. Ecclesiastes 3:11 says, "He has made everything beautiful in its time." Trust that God is weaving something beautiful out of your pain. Your tears are not in vain. Psalm 56:8 reminds us that God collects our tears in His bottle. Every drop is seen by Him, and He's preparing to turn your sorrow into joy. Stop focusing on what's wrong and start focusing on God's promises. Fear wants to paralyze you, but faith will propel you. When you choose faith, you invite God into your circumstances. Scene transition. Speaker moves to a quiet prayer room. Even when you can't see it, God is moving. Romans 8:28 declares, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him." He's aligning people, resources, and opportunities to bring you victory. Psalm 35 reminds us, "Weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning." This season of pain is not permanent. God is preparing a new morning for you, filled with hope and joy. Friend, God's word never fails. Isaiah 55:11 says, "My word will accomplish what I desire and achieve the purpose for which I sent it." Hold on, because God is faithful to every promise He's spoken over your life. God's timing is something we often struggle to understand. We live in a world where everything is instant. We can get food in minutes, a message in seconds, and answers at the touch of a button. Because of this, it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that God's actions should mirror our immediate desires. When we pray, we often expect answers to come quickly, but sometimes it feels like God is taking His time. This can leave us frustrated and questioning, why isn't God answering me right now? But here's the powerful truth that we must remember. God's timing is perfect, and He sees the bigger picture. While we may want things to happen on our timeline, God knows when the right moment is. His plans for our lives are not limited to our understanding of time, and He is never in a hurry. His timing is a reflection of His divine wisdom and love for us. In the book of Ecclesiastes it's written, "To everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven." This tells us that there is a season for everything. While we may not understand the delay or the waiting, God has a purpose in every moment of it. He is orchestrating every step of our journey, and that includes the timing of events. The challenges you face today may feel endless, but God is working behind the scenes, aligning the pieces of your life in perfect harmony. The hardest part about waiting on God is often the feeling of uncertainty. It can seem like nothing is changing or moving, and we may even question whether God is listening to us at all. But remember, God is never idle. He is always at work, whether we see the results immediately or not. Just because we don't see a change in our circumstances doesn't mean God isn't moving. His movements are sometimes hidden from our sight, and we need to trust that He is doing something beautiful and powerful that will be revealed at the right time. Consider the story of Joseph in the Bible. Joseph had dreams of greatness, but those dreams were followed by years of betrayal, imprisonment, and hardship. It would have been easy for him to doubt God's plans, especially when he was stuck in a prison cell with no immediate sign of freedom. Yet through all the suffering, Joseph never lost faith. He trusted that God had a plan, even if he couldn't see it. In the end, God's perfect timing elevated Joseph to a position of leadership, and he was able to save his family and countless others. Joseph's story is a reminder that God's plans are not always immediate, but they are always intentional. Even though it may feel like you are stuck in a situation, God is not absent. He is preparing you, refining you, and making sure everything is aligned for the breakthrough He has in store. Sometimes the waiting period is necessary to build the character, patience, and faith required for the blessings ahead. We may not understand the why behind our wait, but we can trust that it is part of the process. It's important to understand that when we pray, we are not just asking for an outcome. We are aligning ourselves with God's will. Our perspective on timing often differs from His. We see immediate results as the solution, but God sees the end result from the beginning. He knows what's best for us, and He will answer our prayers in a way that brings about the greatest good. Think about the story of Abraham and Sarah. God promised Abraham that he would be the father of many nations, but the promise was not fulfilled immediately. Abraham and Sarah had to wait for decades before they saw the birth of their son, Isaac. Along the way, they tried to take matters into their own hands, but that only led to complications. It was only in God's perfect timing that Isaac was born, and through him, God's promise to Abraham was fulfilled. The waiting wasn't easy, but it was necessary. In God's timing, He knew that Isaac's birth would have the greatest impact. The waiting can be painful, but it is not without purpose. When we wait on God, we are given the opportunity to trust Him more deeply. We learn to lean on Him rather than on our own understanding. We begin to see that God's timing is not only perfect, but that it is also beneficial for our spiritual growth. Through the waiting, God builds our faith, sharpens our vision, and prepares us for the blessings He wants to pour into our lives. There are times when we want to rush things. We get impatient because we don't want to endure hardship or delay. We want our prayers answered now. But God is patient with us, and He desires for us to learn to trust Him in the waiting. When we rely on our own timing, we often miss out on the deeper blessings that come when we allow God to move in His perfect time. Waiting on God is an act of surrender and faith. It is saying, I trust you, God, even when I don't understand why this is taking so long. As we wait, we must guard our hearts against frustration and doubt. It is easy to let impatience take over and to cry out in discouragement. But in those moments, we must remind ourselves that God is faithful. His word tells us that He will never leave us or forsake us. We are not waiting in vain. God is using this time to prepare us for something greater. He is refining us, and when His plan comes to fruition, we will see that it was all worth the wait. In the book of Isaiah, God speaks to His people, saying, "But those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint." This promise assures us that when we wait on God, He will renew our strength. Our waiting is not wasted. It strengthens us, transforms us, and prepares us for what lies ahead. So, when you find yourself in a season of waiting, take heart. Know that God's timing is not just about when things happen, it's about preparing you for what is to come. Trust that God is working, even when you can't see it, and know that His plans for you are far better than anything you could have imagined. His timing is not your timing, but it is perfect, and it will always be worth the wait. So, stop crying, dry your tears, trust that God is in control. You don't have to understand the process. You just have to trust the one who holds your future. Let this be your declaration today. God will work it out, and as you step forward in faith, get ready to see miracles unfold. When life presents challenges, it's natural to feel a sense of fear or anxiety about the outcome. Fear can often grip our hearts, especially when we face the unknown or the seemingly impossible. It's easy to let fear take over, and in those moments, we may question whether God will truly come through for us. However, the call of God is not for us to fear. Instead, it is for us to walk in faith, trusting that He is with us every step of the way. The truth is, faith is the antidote to fear. When we choose faith over fear, we choose to align ourselves with the power and promises of God. Fear often comes when we focus on the circumstances around us, rather than the God who is in control of those circumstances. The enemy wants us to be consumed by fear because he knows that fear paralyzes us and prevents us from walking in the fullness of what God has for us. Fear tells us that the odds are against us, that we are not enough, and that victory is impossible. It tries to drown us in doubt and uncertainty, making us believe that we are destined to fail. But the power of faith changes everything. Faith shifts our perspective from the size of our problems to the greatness of our God. In the book of Isaiah, God makes a bold declaration. "Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." These words remind us that fear is not something we are meant to live with. Instead, we are called to embrace the assurance that God is with us in every circumstance. His presence is not limited by our fears or struggles. When we choose faith, we choose to trust that God will see us through, no matter how dire the situation may appear. Faith, by its nature, involves stepping into the unknown with the confidence that God will work all things for our good. It's about trusting in His promises, even when we don't fully understand the path ahead. Fear tries to convince us that we need to have all the answers before we can move forward. It tells us that we must see the way before we can take a step. But faith tells us to trust in God's character and His ability to guide us, even when we can't see the next step. We may not know how things will work out, but we can be confident that God is already at work behind the scenes, orchestrating everything in our favor. Choosing faith over fear doesn't mean that we won't experience fear at all. Fear is a natural human emotion, but it doesn't have to control us. The key is to acknowledge fear and then choose to place it in the hands of God. We don't have to let fear dictate our actions or decisions. Instead, we are called to surrender our fears to God and trust that He will lead us through them. When we embrace faith, fear loses its grip on us. Faith is also not a passive state. It requires action. When we choose faith, we don't just sit idly by, waiting for something to happen. Faith compels us to move forward with confidence, knowing that God is with us. It's like the story of Peter walking on water. When Jesus called him to step out of the boat, Peter had to take a step of faith. As long as he kept his eyes on Jesus, he was able to walk on water. But the moment he took his eyes off Jesus and focused on the wind and the waves, fear began to sink him. The key to overcoming fear is to keep our eyes fixed on Jesus. When we focus on Him, fear cannot control us. There are many examples in the Bible where people faced impossible situations but chose to walk in faith rather than succumb to fear. David, the young shepherd boy, faced the giant Goliath with nothing but a sling and a stone. Goliath's size and strength should have been enough to strike fear into David's heart, but instead David stood firm in his faith. He knew that God had delivered him from the paw of the lion and the bear, and he trusted that God would deliver him from Goliath as well. His faith in God's power was far greater than his fear of the giant, and with one stone, David defeated Goliath. Similarly, Daniel in the lion's den faced certain death, but his faith in God remained unwavering. When the decree was made that no one could pray to anyone other than the king, Daniel continued to pray to God. He refused to let fear dictate his actions, and as a result, God shut the mouths of the lions, and Daniel emerged unharmed. His faith was greater than the fear of the lions, and God honored his trust in him. Fear can often cause us to shrink back, to stay within our comfort zones and to avoid taking risks. But faith calls us to step out and trust that God will make a way, even when it seems impossible. Faith says, even though I don't know how this is going to work out, I know that God is able. Faith believes that with God, all things are possible. It's important to recognize that choosing faith over fear doesn't mean that we won't experience moments of doubt or fear. It means that when those feelings arise, we don't let them control us. Instead, we turn to God and remind ourselves of His promises. We remember that God has already fought the battle for us and that we are more than conquerors through Christ. We declare His truth over our lives, even when fear tries to cloud our vision. As we learn to choose faith over fear, we also begin to realize that God's power is greater than any fear we face. His love casts out all fear, and His perfect peace guards our hearts and minds. The more we embrace faith, the less room there is for fear. We begin to see that with God on our side, there is nothing we need to fear. So, the next time fear tries to take hold of you, Remember that you don't have to let it control you. Choose faith instead. Trust in God's ability to handle the situation, knowing that He is with you every step of the way. When we walk in faith, we walk in the confidence that God will work it all out, no matter how impossible it may seem. Faith over fear is the key to unlocking the power of God in our lives. It's the key to walking in victory, even in the face of trials. And it's the key to knowing that no matter what happens, God is always working on our behalf. So choose faith today and watch as God moves in ways you never imagined. When we are in the midst of trials, it can be easy to feel like we are carrying the burden of our problems alone. We may look around and see others who seem to have it all together, while we struggle with feelings of despair, confusion, and even hopelessness. But in those very moments, it's important to remember that God is always at work. Even when we can't see or understand what He's doing, He is behind the scenes, orchestrating a plan for our lives that is far greater than anything we could ever imagine. The key is to trust that even though things may not be going the way we expect or hope, God is always working things out for our good. The Bible tells us that God is always working on our behalf. In Romans 8:28, we are reminded that we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. This is a powerful truth that we must hold on to when life gets tough. No matter how difficult the situation, we can rest assured that God is working in ways we may not fully understand. Even in the midst of pain, loss, or disappointment, God's hand is moving behind the scenes to bring about His perfect will in our lives. His plan for us is filled with hope, and even when we can't see it, He is working out the details in ways that will ultimately benefit us. Sometimes, we may feel like we're not making any progress. We might look at our circumstances and feel stuck as if nothing is changing or improving. But it's in these moments that God is often doing His most important work. Just because we can't see immediate results doesn't mean that God isn't at work. We are not meant to understand everything that is happening around us, but we are called to trust that God knows exactly what He's doing. In His perfect timing, He will reveal His plan and bring us through the trials stronger, wiser, and more prepared for the future He has for us. One of the most profound truths we can hold on to is the reality that God doesn't waste our pain. Every difficulty we face is an opportunity for growth, and God uses even our struggles to shape us into the people He has called us to be. The Apostle James writes in James 1:02-4, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." This passage reminds us that trials are not just something to endure, but are opportunities to grow in faith and character. Even though the trials may be hard, they are shaping us and preparing us for greater things to come. God is not abandoning us in our struggles. He is using them to mold us into the person we are meant to become. It can be difficult to see this perspective when we are in the middle of a difficult situation. We may question why things are happening the way they are, or wonder if God has forgotten about us. But the truth is that God's ways are higher than ours, and His plans are always good. He is never caught off guard by the challenges we face. He is always working behind the scenes, working things out in ways we may not understand in the moment. Our job is to trust in His plan, knowing that He is faithful to complete the work He has started in us. One of the most beautiful aspects of God's work behind the scenes is that He is always working for our good, even when we can't see how. This truth gives us hope, especially in times of difficulty. When things don't go according to plan, it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that God has abandoned us or that He doesn't care. But nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, God is often working in ways we can't comprehend, preparing us for something even greater than what we can see. We may not understand the full picture now, but God is faithful, and His promises are sure. What may seem like a setback or a detour is actually part of the process that will lead us to greater blessings and fulfillment in the future. God works behind the scenes not only to bring about His purposes in our lives, but also to bring healing, restoration, and peace. Many times we can feel like we're carrying a heavy load, weighed down by emotional pain, past mistakes, or broken relationships. But God is a God of restoration, and He is always working to bring healing to our hearts. Even in our darkest moments, He is at work, restoring what was lost and making things new. This healing process may take time, but it is worth the wait. Trusting that God is working behind the scenes to bring about our restoration allows us to rest in His peace, knowing that He will make all things right in His perfect time. In addition to healing, God is also working to bring provision and protection into our lives. When we are in need, we can trust that God is our provider. Philippians 4:19 reminds us that, "My God will meet all your needs according to the riches of His glory in Christ Jesus." God is not only aware of our needs, but is actively working to meet them in ways that align with His will for our lives. His provision may not always come in the way we expect, but we can trust that He will always provide for us in the right way and at the right time. Furthermore, God works behind the scenes to protect us from harm, even when we may not be aware of the dangers around us. The Bible tells us that God goes before us, protecting us from evil and guiding our steps. Psalm 91 verse 11 says, "For He will command His angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways." We may not always see or understand the protection God provides, but we can trust that He is watching over us, keeping us safe and secure in His care. When we take the time to reflect on the ways God is working behind the scenes, we begin to recognize that His presence in our lives is constant and unchanging. He is always at work, even when it feels like we're in the dark. His love for us is unwavering, and His promises are certain. No matter what we face, we can trust that God is always working things out for our good. Let us support each other, hoping the unknown continues to be a stranger, and we can continue to walk to the light, step by step, because we know He's working things out for our good. We may not understand how or why things are happening, but we can trust that God is sovereign and His plan will ultimately bring about good in our lives. As we learn to trust in God's work behind the scenes, we begin to experience a deep sense of peace and assurance. We no longer have to worry or be anxious about the future, because we know that God is already there, preparing the way. We can rest in the knowledge that He is working in ways we cannot see, and that He will bring us through every trial, stronger and more equipped to fulfill His purpose for our lives. When we go through difficult seasons, it's easy to feel as though things will never improve, that our struggles will define our future, or that we are somehow doomed to face endless hardship. This perspective often stems from a place of hopelessness, where our circumstances feel overwhelming and unchangeable. But in those moments, we must remember that God's timing is different from ours, and He has a purpose for every season in our lives, even when we can't see it. Even when it feels like nothing is changing, God is working behind the scenes, preparing the breakthrough we've been praying for. The key is to trust His timing and understand that He is always at work, even when it seems like nothing is happening. God's timing is not like our timing. We live in a world where we want things to happen instantly. We want the answer to our prayers to come right away, and we want to see immediate results. But God's timing operates in a way that is beyond our comprehension. He sees the bigger picture, the whole of our lives, and knows exactly when the right time for intervention will be. The beauty of God's timing is that it is always perfect. Even though it might feel like we've been waiting forever, or that nothing is changing, God is preparing everything for the moment when He will reveal the next step in His plan for us. One of the most challenging aspects of trusting in God's timing is the waiting. Waiting can be incredibly difficult, especially when we are longing for a change, for answers, or for relief from our struggles. But in the waiting, God is doing something profound in our hearts. He is refining us, teaching us to rely on Him, and preparing us for what is to come. The Bible is filled with examples of people who had to wait for God's perfect timing. Abraham, for example, received a promise from God that he would be the father of many nations, but he had to wait many years before he saw the fulfillment of that promise. David was anointed as king, but it was many years before he actually took the throne. During these times of waiting, God was preparing them, refining their character, and building their faith. While the waiting was hard, it was necessary for them to become who God had called them to be. The waiting season is not a season of inactivity. Even though it may seem like we are not making progress, God is at work in the background, orchestrating events, aligning circumstances, and preparing us for what lies ahead. When we wait on God, we are not sitting idly by. Rather, we are trusting in His process. Isaiah 40:31 reminds us that, "But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint." When we choose to wait on God, we are choosing to trust in His power, His wisdom, and His love for us. And in that waiting, He renews our strength, equips us for the future, and builds our faith. Sometimes we may question why God allows us to go through seasons of waiting, or why our prayers seem to go unanswered. It's easy to assume that God has forgotten about us, but the truth is that He is never absent. Even in the waiting, He is working. There are times when God needs to prepare us for what's ahead. He knows that if He were to give us what we want right away, we may not be ready for it. Perhaps there are areas in our lives that need to be healed, or lessons that need to be learned before we can step into the next season. God, in His infinite wisdom, is always working behind the scenes to bring about the perfect circumstances for us to thrive. Sometimes we simply have to trust that His timing is better than ours. Another crucial aspect of God's perfect timing is His ability to align events, circumstances, and people in our lives in ways that we could never have orchestrated on our own. We may think we know what's best for us, but God sees everything. He understands what we need and when we need it. In His timing, He makes all things work together for our good. The Bible reminds us in Romans 8:28 that we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. Even though we might not see how things will work out, we can trust that God is aligning every detail for our benefit. Our job is to remain faithful, keep trusting, and continue moving forward in the direction He's leading us. God's timing is also deeply connected to His desire for us to grow in our faith and trust in Him. Often it's when we are waiting and struggling that our faith is tested and strengthened. God wants to teach us to rely on Him fully and to trust Him even when we don't have all the answers. Proverbs 3:5-6 tells us, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your paths straight." This is a beautiful reminder that even when we don't understand what's happening or why things are taking so long, we are called to trust God. We don't need to have everything figured out, and we don't need to know how things will turn out. All we need to do is trust Him, and He will guide us. In the midst of waiting, it's easy to get discouraged, especially when the answers to our prayers don't come as quickly as we had hoped. It's tempting to give up or to think that God isn't listening, but we must remember that God's silence is not a sign of His absence. Just because we don't hear anything doesn't mean He isn't at work. Sometimes God is waiting for us to be ready. Sometimes He is preparing us for something bigger than we could ever imagine. The answer to our prayers may not come right away, but that doesn't mean God has forgotten about us. We must hold on to the truth that God is always faithful and that His promises will never fail. Finally, we must trust that God's perfect timing is always for our good and His glory. His plan for our lives is not to harm us, but to give us a future and a hope. Jeremiah 29:11. While the waiting may be hard, it is in those seasons that God refines us, strengthens us, and prepares us for greater things ahead. Even when we can't see the end result, we can trust that God is faithful to complete the work He has started in us. When we trust His timing, we align ourselves with His will and open the door for Him to do exceedingly abundantly more than we could ever ask or imagine. Certainly. Here is the expanded version of the fifth keynote. In our walk of faith, we are often faced with moments of uncertainty, doubt, and fear. It's not unusual to question whether God is truly working on our behalf, or if He is even listening to our cries for help. These doubts can be amplified when we see no immediate changes or feel stuck in the middle of our struggles. However, even when we don't see any visible progress, we must understand that God is still at work, and He will always come through for us. His ways are higher than our ways, and His thoughts are higher than our thoughts. Just because we can't see the full picture doesn't mean that God is not working on our behalf behind the scenes. One of the most important aspects of understanding how God works is recognizing that His methods are often different from our own. We live in a world that is driven by immediate gratification and quick results. We want things to happen on our timeline, and when they don't, we start to doubt. But God is not bound by our time or our expectations. He sees the entire picture of our lives, and He knows exactly what is needed and when it is needed. While we may be focused on a particular issue or problem, God is working in ways that are preparing us for something far greater. His ultimate goal is not just to fix our immediate problems, but to shape us into the people He has called us to be. When we face difficulties, we may feel that God is distant or that He has forgotten us, but the reality is that God is always with us, even in our most challenging moments. Psalm 139, 7-10 reminds us that there is nowhere we can go where God is not present. Even in the darkness of our struggles, God is right there beside us, guiding us, protecting us, and working out His perfect plan. The fact that we can't always see His hand at work does not mean He is absent. In fact, sometimes it is in the silence of God that His presence is most profoundly felt. It's in the quiet moments of waiting that God is doing His most significant work within us. He is building our faith, strengthening our trust in Him, and preparing us for what lies ahead. We must also recognize that God's work is often happening in ways that we cannot see or understand. We tend to focus on the external circumstances, and when things appear unchanged, we assume that nothing is happening. However, God is always at work in the unseen. He is orchestrating events, aligning people and opportunities, and preparing us for the next step in His plan. Just because we cannot immediately perceive the changes doesn't mean they are not occurring. The Bible assures us that God works all things together for the good of those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. Romans 8:28. Even in the midst of our trials, God is working for our good, refining our character, and shaping us into who He wants us to be. One of the reasons why we may not see God's work in our lives is that we often focus solely on the visible outcomes. We pray for solutions to our problems, and when those solutions do not come in the way we expect, we become discouraged. However, the answer to our prayers is not always in the form we anticipate. Sometimes, God is more interested in transforming our hearts than changing our circumstances. The process of growth and transformation is often much more important than the immediate relief we desire. In these moments, God is teaching us to trust Him more deeply, to rely on His strength, and to submit to His will. He is shaping our character, developing our perseverance, and increasing our faith. God's work is also unfolding in the spiritual realm where we may not have direct access. We know that there is a spiritual battle going on all around us. While we may not see the forces at work, the Bible assures us that God is actively involved in this spiritual warfare. In Ephesians 6:12, we are reminded that our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against spiritual forces of evil. This battle is not something we can see with our natural eyes, but it is real. And even though we may feel weak or helpless, God is always fighting on our behalf. He is interceding for us, sending His angels to protect us, and working through the Holy Spirit to strengthen us in ways we cannot imagine. Another important aspect of recognizing that God is working, even when we don't see it, is understanding the role of faith. Faith is not just about believing that God will act in a particular way or within a specific time frame. It's about trusting that He is good, faithful, and present no matter what. Faith is about trusting in God's character and His promises, even when the circumstances don't seem to align with what we've been praying for. Hebrews 11:01 defines faith as the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. It is the ability to trust in God's goodness and faithfulness, even when we cannot see the evidence of His work. In our journey of faith, there will be times when we must wait on God's timing. The Bible encourages us to be patient and to trust that God's timing is perfect. Psalm 27:14 says, "Wait for the Lord, be strong and take heart, and wait for the Lord." Waiting is one of the most challenging aspects of the Christian walk, especially when we are desperate for answers or relief. But the waiting process is not a passive one. While we wait, we are called to remain active in our faith, to continue trusting, to keep praying, and to believe that God is working behind the scenes. Waiting is an opportunity to deepen our relationship with God, to grow in our dependence on Him, and to strengthen our trust that He is faithful. In times of uncertainty, we may also feel tempted to take matters into our own hands. It's easy to try to force solutions or to manipulate situations to get the results we want. However, the Bible tells us that when we do things in our own strength, we often end up making things worse. Proverbs 3:5 and 6 encourages us to trust in the Lord with all our hearts and not to lean on our own understanding. When we choose to surrender our plans to God and wait for His perfect timing, we align ourselves with His will and open the door for Him to work in ways that we cannot imagine. It is also important to remember that God is working for our ultimate good. While we may not understand why certain things happen in our lives or why certain prayers are not immediately answered, we can trust that God is always acting with our best interests in mind. His plans for us are filled with hope, and He is working everything together for our good. Jeremiah 29:11. Even when things don't make sense, we can rest assured that God is faithful to keep His promises. His love for us is unwavering, and He will never leave us or forsake us. We all experience moments of doubt and discouragement, especially when it feels like God is not answering our prayers or working in our lives as we hoped. During these times, it is easy to get overwhelmed by our circumstances and lose sight of God's presence. We may wonder if He is truly listening, if He really cares, or if He will ever come through for us. These feelings are natural, but they do not reflect the full truth of God's nature and His commitment to His people. It is essential to remember that God's ways are higher than our own, and He works in ways that we cannot always see or understand. Even when it seems like nothing is happening, God is always at work, shaping us, guiding us, and preparing us for something greater. One of the key truths that we must hold on to when it feels like nothing is happening is that God is faithful, and He is always working on our behalf. God's faithfulness is not dependent on our circumstances. Even when we cannot perceive His actions, we can trust that He is faithful to keep His promises. This is a foundational truth of the Christian faith. God has promised to never leave us or forsake us, and He is always working for our good. Hebrews 13 verse 5. His faithfulness is not contingent on our feelings or perceptions, but on His unchanging nature. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Hebrews 13:8. Regardless of what we are going through, God's faithfulness is constant. One of the reasons why we may not see God's work in our lives immediately is that His timing is different from ours. We often want things to happen on our timeline, but God's timing is perfect. In His wisdom, He knows when the right time is for us to receive answers to our prayers. Sometimes God is working in ways that we cannot see because He is preparing us for something greater, or He is orchestrating events that need to align perfectly before we can receive His blessings. It can be frustrating when we don't see immediate results, but we must remember that God's timing is always perfect, even when it doesn't make sense to us. Waiting is a crucial part of our faith journey, and through it, God develops our trust and dependence on Him. Another reason we may feel like nothing is happening is because we are looking for answers in the wrong places. We may expect God to work in a certain way or answer our prayers in a specific manner, but often His answers come in unexpected forms. God does not work according to our expectations, and sometimes His answers may come in a different way or at a different time than we anticipate. This is why it is essential to trust in God's wisdom and not lean on our own understanding. Proverbs 3:5-6 tells us to trust in the Lord with all our hearts and not to rely on our own understanding. When we release our expectations and allow God to move in His own way, we open ourselves up to receive His blessings in the way He has planned for us. It is also important to recognize that God's work in our lives is often taking place in the unseen. We live in a world that values the visible and the immediate, but God is working in the spiritual realm in ways that we cannot always perceive with our natural eyes. In Ephesians 6:12, we are reminded that our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against spiritual. While we may not see these spiritual battles taking place, we can trust that God is actively involved, fighting on our behalf. He is working behind the scenes, moving in ways that we cannot comprehend to bring about His perfect will. Even when we cannot see it, God is at work, and He is orchestrating events in our favor. When we feel like nothing is happening, it is important to remember that God is also at work in our hearts and lives, developing our character. God is not only interested in answering our prayers or meeting our needs, He is also concerned with shaping us into the people He has called us to be. This process of sanctification is often slow and requires patience, but it is an essential part of our spiritual growth. God is teaching us to rely on Him, to trust Him more deeply, and to become more like Christ. This inner transformation may not always be visible to others, but it is a vital part of God's work in our lives. In Romans 8:29, we are reminded that God's ultimate goal is to conform us to the image of His Son. While this process may involve challenges and difficulties, it is through these trials that God refines us and strengthens our faith. Moreover, we must understand that God's work in our lives is not always about fixing our immediate problems or giving us what we think we need. Sometimes God's greatest work is in the waiting, the testing, and the refining process. When we face challenges, it can feel like nothing is happening because the solution is not coming immediately. But God is at work, even in the delay. In Psalm 27:14, David encourages us to wait for the Lord with courage and strength. Waiting on God can be difficult, especially when we are desperate for answers. But it is through this waiting that our faith is strengthened. God uses these seasons of waiting to build our endurance, to teach us patience, and to develop a deeper trust in His faithfulness. In addition, we must remember that God is not limited by our circumstances. He is not confined by the limitations we experience in this world. When it feels like nothing is happening, it is easy to get discouraged and believe that our situation is hopeless. But God is not bound by the limitations of our circumstances. He is all-powerful, and He can do exceedingly more than we can ask or imagine. Ephesians 3:20. Even when we don't see a way out of our situation, God is working in ways that we cannot see. He is able to make a way where there seems to be no way. Our job is to trust Him, even when the path ahead seems. Finally, when we feel like nothing is happening, it is important to remember that God is always working in our favor. He is working for our good, even when we cannot see it. Romans 8:28 assures us that in all things, God works for the good of those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. Even in the midst of our trials and challenges, God is working for our ultimate good. He is shaping us, preparing us, and making us ready for the blessings that He has in store for us. Even when we cannot see the full picture, we can trust that God is working on our behalf, and He will never leave us or forsake us. In conclusion, when it feels like nothing is happening, we must hold on to the truth that God is always at work. His faithfulness is unwavering, His timing is perfect, and His plans for us are good. Even when we cannot see the changes or feel like nothing is happening, God is working behind the scenes, preparing us for something greater. Our job is to trust Him, to wait patiently, and to believe that He will come through for us in His perfect time. God is always working, and He will never leave us in our struggles. Trust Him, even when you can't see it, because He is always working for your good.